Well, good evening. Good evening, everybody. I'm Doug Bradburn. I'm the founding director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington. For those of you who don't know me, that's George Washington's presidential library right across the street from here. For those of you who haven't had a chance to come see it, I hope you noticed that we do have book talks every month, and I encourage you to come check us out. I want everybody to know that it's an institution that has a public mission. Even though it's a private research library, it is open for business and ready to go, and everything is going very well there. So welcome this evening. We have a very special lecture tonight. This, of course, is the beginning of our Michelle Smith lecture series. And the first thing to note, of course, is that this series was possible because of the generous donation of Robert H. Smith and the Robert H. Smith Family Foundation. Robert H. Smith, as you all know, was a great philanthropist. He passed in 2009, but this auditorium is the Robert H. and Clarice Smith Auditorium. He has given a lot of money to the University of Maryland, as well as George Washington University, Johns Hopkins University, our friends at Monticello, at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies. There's the Robert H. Smith International Center for Constitutional Studies at Montpelier. So a great patriotic philanthropist, and we're delighted to have this special lecture series in honor of his daughter, Michelle Smith, who also has been a great friend in Mount Vernon, as well as his son, David Smith, who we are delighted to have working with us closely all the time. So, it's a great series, and we're excited to see you. I do want to mention a change. When some of you bought your tickets, we had originally, as the May 5th lecturer, Rick Beeman to talk about his new book. I do want to apologize. He's not going to be able to make that appointment because of health difficulties that he's having, but we've replaced him on the same date with David O. Stewart, who you may know his earlier work on the Constitutional Convention was a Washington Post bestseller. And he's going to be talking about his brand new book, Madison's Gift, 5 Partnerships That Built America, which is really a beautiful study on the role of partnership in the creation of this country. He looks at Madison's relationship with Washington and Jefferson and even Hamilton, and of course Dolly Madison as well, to create what America would become. So mark your calendars. It's a different speaker, but it will still be a great lecture as well. Now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Laura Auricchio here, Dr. Laura Auricchio, who is going to talk about her new book, The Marquis, one of our favorite people, Lafayette, Reconsidered, and it's going to be a treat for you because Professor Dr. Auricchio is trained in art history. And you know that Mount Vernon loves its art historians. She has an incredible ability to get at the performance of the 18th century. As you know, it was a lot of stagecraft, and so it's important in understanding Lafayette in that way. Lafayette in America, but Lafayette in France as well. She's trained as an art historian of the French Revolution. And so to have someone who's an expert on the French Revolution looking into Lafayette is always so crucial, because it is a very different experience in 18th century France than it is in 18th century America. So we're very lucky to have her attention. She has her PhD in art history from Columbia University. She has been a recipient of Fulbright and Whiting fellowships, had held various positions, but right now is the Dean of Undergraduate Studies at the New School, which she tells me is the hippest school in New York. So, and they don't call her doctor there, they call her Laura there. So let's give her a big Mount Vernon welcome.
Thank you. I just want to start with a just very brief statement, which is that I give a lot of talks, and I have no stage fright. But being here, I find so moving to actually be at Mount Vernon. So please forgive me if I get slightly emotional. It's not normally in my character, but just today I'm feeling so grateful to be here. And I'm particularly grateful to the Fred W. Smith National Library, its founding director, Douglas Bradburn, Stephen McLeod, and everybody else who works here. Everyone has just been amazing and supportive and helpful. And thank you all for coming out on an evening which is thankfully not snowing, which I gather it was about a week ago. So I'd like to begin with just a brief anecdote that I also relate at the start of my book. It was a rainy Friday afternoon in April of 2009, and I found myself sliding along slick cobblestones in the courtyard of the Chateau of Versailles, and I was trying to keep pace with a French curator who was walking fairly briskly and muttering as he did so. And he had a large ring of very large old keys with him, and he was flipping through these keys, and he was displeased with these keys for some reason. And apparently, as I came to understand, he didn't know exactly where we were going or why we were going there, and he was sort of irked. But eventually we found the room, and it was quite a distance from any place that anybody was actually going to. We left behind all the tour buses, and we were walking farther and farther away, and finally we found a room, and he opened it up, turned on the lights, and there was a sort of fine film of dust over everything. Clearly this was not a place that was very often visited. And I was there, I had brought him there to see this bust. This is a bust of the Marquis de Lafayette by Jean-Antoine Houdon, and those of you who are Washington fans will be familiar with Jean-Antoine Houdon. In fact, there's a very large sculpture of him, a standing sculpture of Washington by Houdon in the Virginia State Capitol in Richmond, and many others around town. So I had dragged him here to see this bust, and I was looking at this bust and contemplating it when all of a sudden the curator said, "Why should we have a bust of Lafayette?" Now, he said it in French, so I thought perhaps I had misunderstood. So I said, "Pardon?" And he did what all people do when a foreigner doesn't understand them. He said it again, louder and slower. And so I said, "Oh yes, well, I understand. So yes, why should we have a bust of Lafayette?" "Well," I proceeded to tell him, "we should have a bust of Lafayette because Lafayette is the French hero of the American Revolution. It was Lafayette, he was only 19 years old. He was one of the wealthiest men in France outside of the royal family when he chose to serve under George Washington as a volunteer. He persuaded the French crown to assist the American cause. He was highly influential in the Virginia campaign and the siege of Yorktown. So of course we should have a bust of Lafayette." And I was saying all this when I suddenly realized that the curator was not impressed. And he sort of shook his head, and he motioned to a plaque that was installed a few feet away. And this was a plaque that was commemorating the thousands of Frenchmen, soldiers and sailors, who had fought, and many of them died, in the American Revolution. And he said, "All of these men fought in your revolution. Many of them died. You don't know their names." He said, "Louis XVI bankrupted France for your revolution, and he got his thanks from the guillotine. We have no sculptures of him. And besides that, it wasn't Lafayette, it was Rochambeau who led the French forces. Why do you Americans insist on adoring Lafayette?" And I thought about it, and I thought that the man had a point. In the sense that, although Americans all love Lafayette, or even if they don't love him, even if they don't know exactly what they did, they certainly harbor no ill will towards the man. Nobody even feels ambivalent about him. But things are quite different in France. And what I'm showing you here is an image, and this is not the least kind image that I've seen of Lafayette. This is an image that kind of sums up the French, shall we say, problem with Lafayette. This is an image from around 1790 or so, or 1791, that depicts Lafayette as, quite literally, two-faced. On one hand, on the left-hand side, he is on the left-hand side, he is a man of the people, and on the right-hand side, he's a man of the court. And this, in fact, was Lafayette's problem in France, is Lafayette's problem in France, is that Lafayette, during the French Revolution, wanted to create a constitutional monarchy. He did not want to create a republic, an American-style republic in France. He did not think France could sustain such a republic, and he did not want to maintain the absolute monarchy that France had. So on the left and on the right, both sides thought that he was a traitor to their cause. And to this day, that remained the case in much of France. So I became very interested in this question, which is, how is it that Lafayette, a man who lived by a principle that he himself called moderation, and was really very unwavering in his principles throughout his entire life, how could such a steadfast man have obtained two such dramatically different reputations on each side of the Atlantic? So, in order to answer this question, as an art historian, I thought that I would start to turn to the question not only of what he did, but also in how what he did was remembered, how it was received, how it was represented, how it was depicted. And tonight, I'd like to focus a bit on that, but also more specifically on the role that George Washington played in crafting Lafayette's reputation. So to begin to answer the curator's question then, we should have a bust of Lafayette in part because Lafayette wanted us to. And Lafayette wanted us to, in part, because he wanted to reinvent himself in America, just as many of our, or at least I should speak for myself, my ancestors did. He came here for the opportunities that the New World afforded. Now, it might seem unusual that a man who was living here would have wanted to reinvent himself. This is an awfully nice place. This is where he was living in 1776 when he signed a contract with Silas Deane to serve in General Washington's army. This was the Hôtel de Noailles. It was located on the Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris. That's directly across from where the Tuileries Palace once stood. Today, the Tuileries Palace is no longer there, but the gardens are still there. It's very close to the Louvre Palace. And Lafayette lived there because he had married into a family that was extremely close to King Louis XV, the Noailles family. And their physical proximity to the court was echoed by their influence at court. It was, for example, one of the Noailles women who was charged with the unenviable task of turning Marie Antoinette, when she was the Dauphine, of turning her into a proper French queen. And in fact, she was so sort of old school that she was known by Marie Antoinette and Marie Antoinette's friend as Madame Etiquette, because she was so sort of insistent on precision and such. So Lafayette was living here. But the problem that he had was that he was not from here. He was from here. And this is a very different place. What you're seeing on your left is a map of France, and what you can see is that this is Paris, and this is the area from which Lafayette hailed. This is the Auvergne, and this is the town of Clermont-Ferrand, which is the capital. It's about 400 miles south of Paris. As you can see, it's a volcanic area. This is a photo that I took just a couple of years ago from the chateau. You can see the hills around it. Even today, it's not built up at all. Today, people go there because it's rustic charms. People go and they actually rent out these stone huts that shepherds lived in, and they dine on lentils that are considered the finest in the world, and they have pungent cheeses, and they have wonderful sausages. And this is the home in which Lafayette grew up, Chavagnac. Now, all of these rustic attributes today are very appealing to nature-seeking visitors. However, in the 18th century, it was considerably less desirable. So just to give you a sense of in this period. Now, he was there in 1789. Now, Arthur Young, being English, disliked most of what he found in France. But he reserved particular disdain for the town of Clermont-Ferrand, which he wrote, quote, "is in the midst of a most curious country, all volcanic, and is built and paved with lava. Much of it forms one of the worst built, dirtiest, and most stinking places I have met with." He wasn't done. There are many streets that can, for blackness, dirt, and ill sense, only be represented by narrow channels cut in a night dunghill. The contention, he's still not done. The contention of nauseous savors with which the air is impregnated when brisk mountain gales do not ventilate these excrementitious lanes. That's my favorite word. Made me envy the nerves of the good people, who, for what I know, may be happy in them. So this is where Lafayette was from. And had all gone according to plan, he would have lived out his life there. However, his family, as I said earlier in a conversation with Dr. Bradburn, his family had a habit of marrying well and dying young, so that Lafayette's situation changed very abruptly. And in 1774, he was 17 years old, an orphan, and one of France's wealthiest men outside of the Princes of the Blood. And in that year, he was presented at the court of Versailles, and he married the 15-year-old Adrienne de Noailles. Now, what you see on the top is Chavagnac, and on the bottom is Versailles. Needless to say, at Versailles, Lafayette's wealth counted for almost nothing. There, he was seen as a rugged young man from the provinces, and he fit in not at all. Standing 5'9" tall, he was rather large for the day, and his awkward bearing did nothing to make his presence any less conspicuous. His friend, the Comte de Ségur, and this is his friend speaking, remembered that he exhibited, quote, a cold and grave exterior, which sometimes gave to his demeanor an air of timidity and embarrassment. And Lafayette himself wrote that disguised pride lay at the root of his reticence, because as a rule he refused to participate in conversation that he deemed not worthy of being discussed. Now, of course, this is 18th century France, when wit and banter were the currency of polite society, and Lafayette refused to participate in them. He acknowledged, in addition, that his exterior quietness was sort of exacerbated by, quote, the gaucheness of my manners, which, without being out of place on any important occasion, never yielded to the graces of the court or the charms of supper in the capital. And this was evidently not a case of false modesty. The Comte de la Marque, a Belgian nobleman and confidant of Marie Antoinette, remembered that Lafayette, and these are damning traits, quote, danced without grace and sat badly on his horse. And worst of all, Lamarck tells of a time when Lafayette participated in one of the quadrilles that Marie Antoinette sponsored, but he, quote, proved himself to be so maladroit that the queen could not stop herself from laughing. Unsuited, as he was, to the life of a courtier, which is what his in-laws envisioned for him, he imagined that his career would lie in the French army. However, that dream came to a crashing halt in 1776, when sweeping army reforms unceremoniously removed him, along with hundreds of other young and untested officers, from the army. And this is just another example of a contrast between Chavagnac on top and Versailles on the bottom. You can see it's not a shabby place, Chavagnac. I mean, it's much nicer than my home, but still, it's something that does not hold a candle to Versailles. And so it was that in 1776, Lafayette was feeling very ill at ease here at Versailles, had been removed from the army, and into their midst arrived a group of Americans. In particular, Silas Deane came. He was a wealthy merchant representing Connecticut in the Continental Congress, and then Benjamin Franklin came a little bit later. And at this moment in time in Paris, America was actually all the rage. The French had done something, I actually find this amusing. You remember how we once renamed French fries Freedom Fries? It wasn't too long ago. Well, what they did at that time was they renamed the English card game whist. They called it Le Boston. And they had all of these songs that were celebrating les insurgents, the insurgents, the American insurgents. And Marie Antoinette wanted Narragansett horses for her stables. And everybody in Paris wanted a portrait of Benjamin Franklin. And this fellow, Joseph Duplessis, if you think you've seen this picture someplace, you probably have, because he basically created a cottage industry out of making these pictures of Franklin, because everybody who's anybody in Paris wanted to have a portrait of Franklin above their mantelpiece. So this was all of a sudden a great opportunity for Lafayette. America was all the rage. French officers who had all been unceremoniously removed from the army were lining up in droves to come to America. But Lafayette had something that they didn't, most of them, which is he had his own money and he was an orphan, which meant that he was independent and he could do what he wanted. So although his highly situated in-laws, the Noailles, they wanted to come as well to America, but when their father told them not to, they didn't come. Lafayette came anyway. He just bought his own ship. And when he came, his arrival actually made quite a stir in France. Although in America, initially, George Washington was not entirely sure what to do with Lafayette. Because at this moment in time, in 1777, Washington had pretty much seen all he wanted to see of French officers coming over to show the Americans how they should be running their army, or to replace the Americans who were already occupying positions in the army, and they thought that they could do it better. So this is a situation that Lafayette arrived into. Washington was really not so sure that he wanted him here. Moreover, Silas Deane had, sort of inexplicably from Washington's perspective, given Lafayette the rank of Major General, and Lafayette had never seen a day of battlefield action. So when Lafayette arrives, Washington writes to Congress and actually says, "What the intentions of Congress are with regard to the Marquis de Lafayette, I know no more than the child unborn." He said, Lafayette appears to believe that he should be placed in command, whereas I assumed the title was merely honorary. So there was some discussion about this, and eventually what happened is that Benjamin Franklin sent a letter over to America and said, listen, this is all that Lafayette wants. He's very well connected, he's very well placed, he just wants a little bit of glory. So please, if there's an opportunity coming up in which he might win a bit of fame without being hazarded too much. That's the exact words, without being hazarded too much. Please avail yourself of that opportunity, and then he'll go home, basically, he'll go home and he'll tell everybody back home how great we are, and it'll be good. So Washington said, okay, well, such an opportunity is at hand, because at this moment in time, the British were marching towards Philadelphia, which they would take not very long after. Now, what you see here is this is Chad's Ford, this is the Brandywine River, and this is Chad's Ford, this is where Washington was expecting to engage the British. And so he placed himself here with General Greene and others, expecting the British, because this is the most direct route to Philadelphia, this way. Therefore, he placed Lafayette here, which was sort of about as far away as possible from the scene of the anticipated action, while still being roughly on the battlefield. Unfortunately, what happened was that Washington was surprised, and he discovered that he had been engaging only with half of the British forces, and the other half were coming around this way. The British, of course, were in red. Sorry, I should have said that. The British are in red. The rest were coming around this way, and Lafayette, who had been placed here to be out of the action, was suddenly right in the thick of the action. So that Lafayette was wounded in the leg at the Battle of Brandywine. Now, again, Washington still believes that all Lafayette really wanted was an opportunity to make a bit of a name and go home. So Washington inaugurated Lafayette's American celebrity by writing a description of the American loss at Brandywine, which mentioned only two people by name, and one of them was Lafayette, saying he had been wounded in the leg. But as it happened, and this letter from Washington made its way around Patriot papers up and down the coast. But it turned out that's not all that Lafayette wanted. Lafayette actually wanted to make a difference. And so he spent his time recovering with the Moravian Brethren, writing letters to Frenchmen, to the French court, to influential people in France, telling them how worthy the American cause was and how close the Americans were to winning. And he spent the rest of his time writing to Americans, telling them how much the French wanted to support them, even though that was not entirely true. But he really identified himself and made himself into the sort of foremost advocate for a French-American alliance. He then went on to serve under Washington, who came to really trust him. And in 1778, though, he decided it was time to go home for a bit. This was in part back to Paris. This was in part because by now the Treaty of Amity and Commerce had been signed between France and America, and Lafayette wanted either to be placed in the French army, to serve under the French army, or else to be placed in command of any forces that the French might send. So this painting of George Washington actually played a role in Lafayette's attempt to win over the command of the French forces. So in August of 1778, Lafayette was having dinner at the home of John Hancock in Boston. And he saw John Hancock give the Comte d'Estaing, who was a French admiral, he saw Hancock give the Comte d'Estaing a copy of this portrait of Washington by Charles Willson Peale. And Lafayette was so moved by this that he wrote to Washington and he said, quote, "I never saw a man so glad of possessing his sweetheart's picture as the admiral was to receive yours." So Lafayette was so struck by this event that he acquired a small copy from Peale, and he also arranged for the Army engineer Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the designer of Washington, D.C., to sketch Washington from life. This portrait of Washington played a unique role for Lafayette, which was that in 1779 and 80, while he was on furlough in Paris, he commissioned a few variations on this image, including the one on the left. Now, the one on the left is a painting by a French artist, possibly Louis Trinquès, and it's a portrait that sort of transforms the Peale picture. Now it depicts Washington holding two very important documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. Those are the two documents that he's holding, and under his feet are the shredded edicts of His Britannic Majesty. And as Lafayette described it, this painting was something that he really used to publicize the fact that he was Washington's friend. So, for example, he brought this picture with him to Benjamin Franklin's house in Paris for a 4th of July celebration. And he also wrote to the Comte de Vergennes, who was the French foreign minister. He said, "If you're curious to see a portrait that resembles my friend," meaning Washington, "I beg you to send to my home for it." And then he went on to explain to France's foremost foreign minister that, quote, "Things like this make a great impression on our new allies." Now, the French foreign minister was not overly impressed by this theory. And then on the right, I'm just showing you a print that Lafayette commissioned after this painting. As you can see, this depicts Washington, for reasons I cannot quite understand, with an turbaned African servant. But I think the important part of this picture, of the print, which was something that was circulated and made for sale, is that at the bottom it says that this is a painting, this is a print made after the original in the collection of the Marquis de Lafayette. So in other words, with this image, Lafayette's name and Washington's circulated around Paris together. So, as we know, Lafayette was not, as my curator friend pointed out, Lafayette was not granted command of the French forces. That honor went to Rochambeau. But Lafayette returned anyway on the Hermione, which will be returning here in June, a replica thereof. And he then went on to serve in the American Army and to play a very influential role in the Virginia campaign and at the siege of Yorktown. But after the siege of Yorktown, when many of the French officers returned home to France, most of them went on to reprise whatever careers they had had before. But if you recall, Lafayette had no career left to reprise. And so essentially, America became Lafayette's career. It became more than his career. It became his passion. It became his identity, really. America, for the rest of his life, would be the center of his identity. The American explorer, who was in France in 1787, described it as follows. He said that Lafayette, quote, has planted a tree in America and sits under its shade at Versailles. So, in other words, what he was doing was he continued to establish himself as France's foremost advocate for things American. He advocated for good trading arrangements between France and America, for example. And he did everything he could to fashion himself as American, in a sense, in a way that only a French nobleman could, really. So what I'm showing you here is two things. On the left is a map of Paris. This shows you where the Hôtel de Noailles was located, which was on the right bank of Paris, and it was here, the Rue Saint-Honoré. Lafayette, when he purchased his own home, and you see this is not actually his home, but this is a home that was built on the same plan by the same architect, by the same developer in the same year, adjacent to Lafayette's home. But Lafayette's home itself no longer stands. So this is the closest I could get. But I think it's close enough to give you a sense. And it was over here. And as you can see, so it was on the left bank. And this is an area that, when this mid-18th century map was created, was not even developed. So unlike this area, which is the height of the seat of royal power, this area was really sort of the fringes, the outskirts. And this is where Lafayette chose to move. And as you can see from this townhouse, it's a lovely house, but it's nothing compared to the Hôtel de Noailles, a much more modest home. And Lafayette really self-consciously made this into an Americanized home. He came to America to visit a peaceful United States for the first time in 1784, and he came right here to Mount Vernon. And he wrote these wonderful letters to his wife from Mount Vernon. And he said that he was so enjoying friends that it made him think about domesticity, made him think about Cincinnatus, made him think that he was going to become a less retired Cincinnatus, and that he wanted to emulate Washington in his home here. So he basically turned his home into, he actually created a room which he referred to as the American Museum, and it was actually attached to, this was his home office, basically his cabinet, and the room that was his museum was next to it. And in his cabinet, he had things like a gold engraved copy of the Declaration of Independence, which he acquired through assistance from Benjamin Franklin's grandson. He also he brought back American plants, which he told his wife to plant around the terrace. He brought back a Native American man, actually, as a favored servant. He named his son George Washington Lafayette, and he named his daughter Virginia. And when he named his daughter, in fact, Benjamin Franklin quipped, because Benjamin Franklin always had a quip, unlike Lafayette, Benjamin Franklin had no trouble in Paris. Benjamin Franklin quipped that that he hoped the Lafayettes would have 13 children, so they could name one for each of the states of the Union. And he did say, though, that he felt sort of sorry for Miss Massachusetts, whose name is not very mellifluous. But in his home, he made this a center of American sociability. And he has, in Cornell, they have a great Lafayette collection at Cornell Library. They have these invitations that he had printed up in English that said, "You are cordially invited to the home of Madame the Marquis and Marquise de Lafayette on the Rue de Bourbon," the Rue de Bourbon, on Monday evening the blank, because every Monday was American night. And at these American dinners, the Adamses came, the Franklins came, the Jeffersons came, and we have all of their reports of what it was like to be there. And apparently the Lafayette children sang songs in English to entertain the guests. And Abigail Adams, who really, she was a staunch New Englander, and she did not like much of what she saw in Paris, but she accepted Lafayette's home from that, her sort of blanket distaste for much of what went on in Paris. And in fact, when she wrote about Adrienne de Lafayette, his wife, and she said, she's a French woman who loves her husband. I'll repeat that. A French woman who loves her husband. It was something that seemed sort of completely out of character. And so it was that in 1789, when the Bastille fell, Lafayette had so identified himself with Washington and with all things American that it was to Lafayette that Paris turned. The hope was that Lafayette could do what Washington had done, that Lafayette could be the man to lead his nation to a new era of liberty. And what I'm showing you here is actually just two objects, kind of like the house. I don't know if Lafayette owned these exact things, but they were both produced in serial, and he owned one of each of them. On the left is a painting of the Bastille's demolition. On the right, it's one of my favorite objects in the world, and I just love showing it. It is a sculpture of the Bastille, carved from a stone of the Bastille by someone who was liberated from the Bastille. And this man basically, as you can see, stones were plentiful because they were removing them, and this man basically made sort of a lifetime, well, not a lifetime, but he made a living out of carving and selling these stones of the Bastille. So initially, Lafayette was hailed as the French George Washington, and he was placed in the command of the National Guard, and he was seen as a man who would be a liberator of France. And so, for example, on the right, you see Lafayette assisting France in vanquishing the hydra of despotism. However, Lafayette's hold over the city of Paris was tenuous from the very start. So if July was the fall of the Bastille, by October, things had started to go awry. And the month of October opened in Paris with hunger rampant and conspiracies roiling the court and the National Assembly and rumors of counter-revolution flying, when on the morning of October 5th, 1789, a group of women, market women, sellers of fish and other staples, started to gather at the Hôtel de Ville at City Hall, which was Lafayette's center of command. And they were bringing with them any kinds of arms that they could find: cannons, guns, pitchforks, scythes, pikes, you name it, they brought it. And they were infuriated with their families. And there had been rumors flying that at Versailles that the king's bodyguard had been having these orgiastic banquets at which they had been not only eating themselves into a frenzy, but also trampling on the cockade of the revolution. And this just seemed like an insult. And so the women of Paris came together and were joined by their brothers and their sons and their husbands and their neighbors, and they were armed too. And by the time Lafayette arrived at the scene by the afternoon of October 5th, the crowd was demanding a march to Versailles. They wanted to go to Versailles. They said they were going to bring back the baker and his wife because they wanted bread. And the baker and his wife being Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And actually it turned out that actually a group had already departed armed for Versailles by the time Lafayette got there by the middle of the day. So Lafayette had very little choice but to accompany the crowd to Versailles. And by the time he got there in the morning of October 6th, the heads of two royal bodyguards were already making their way backs to Paris. The bodies were not. And Lafayette managed to wrest control of the crowd, but he did so by doing two things. One was that he demonstrated that he still respected Marie Antoinette. And he went out on the balcony with her, and he bent down and kissed her hand in front of the whole crowd. And this evidently seemed to calm things sufficiently for Lafayette to then negotiate between the king and the crowd. He said that, okay, he would escort the king and queen back to Paris with the crowd, and he would guarantee that they would be okay. That, of course, in the end didn't happen. But his actions that day ultimately cost him the confidence of both the crown and the people, because the critics who supported the monarchy thought that he was plotting to incite a riot to prove his own strength, And so, for example, one newspaper asked, quote, this is a royalist newspaper, said, "Why, citizens, have Lafayette and the leaders of the Commune left you wanting for bread? Imbecile residents of Paris and Versailles, these villains think that you have too much life in you. Anyone," the anonymous author went on, "would be a fool to believe that your lives are more secure in the hands of the traitor Lafayette, the scoundrel, this vampire, than in those of your good king." Well, Lafayette's reputation remained alive with the people for some time, and in fact, in 1790, he was at the center of a wonderful festivity held at the Champ de Mars, which is where the Eiffel Tower stands today. And this was an event, which you see him here, in which he led the nation in swearing an oath to the nation, the law, and the king. He believed this was sort of the culmination of the revolution, that this would be the moment at which a constitutional monarchy would be created, and that things would then go on from there in a wonderful, free, liberty-filled land. The monarchists were still not too pleased with him. This is a quip, again, from, it's a monarchist caricature that describes Lafayette. It says, "The reputation of a great general is like a candle that only burns when it's among the people and then it goes out." The idea being that Lafayette was stirring up the people in order to advance his own reputation. However, Lafayette lost the favor of those very people on that very spot just about a year later on the Champ de Mars, when on July 17th of 1781, the king and queen had attempted to flee the country. They were captured at a town named Varennes. They were brought back, and about a month later, a crowd gathered on the Champ de Mars demanding to sign a petition declaring the monarchy abdicated. What precisely happened that day is still unclear. What we do know is that there was violence, that rocks were thrown, that the National Guard under Lafayette's command were patrolling the perimeter on horseback, that shots were fired, and that somewhere between 8 and 100 people died. We still don't know the number, but essentially the National Guard fired on the people. And the incident was immediately dubbed the massacre at the Champ de Mars, and Lafayette was held accountable for it. And it's actually interesting. I just want to share with you just another quote from the left side, which was the radical press, which called it the massacre of the Champ de Mars. One journalist wrote that he saw of Lafayette, that he saw nothing but the most dangerous enemy of liberty in you, in whom we placed all of our confidence, and who should have been liberty's strongest supporter. So Lafayette was lambasted in newspapers, pamphlets, and caricatures of every political stripe. At the very least, he was seen, as he is on the right, as an ineffective protector, a scarecrow that is doing nothing at all to protect the fields. On the left, he is depicted in a royalist image as a centaur, half man, half horse, who is blithely, and this is a joke, le centaure, in French means the blameless one, but it also sounds like the centaur. Le centaure is the same word. So this is Lafayette galloping along as though he's blameless, dropping the key to the Bastille as he goes past the heads of monarchists that have been cut off. So Lafayette was lambasted from the left and the right until we finally, this I think pretty much sums it up. It's a caricature that says, Lafayette treated as he deserves by both the Democrats and the aristocrats. So this is essentially the Royalists and the Republicans agree on nothing except that they both want Lafayette dead. And this, in fact, played out in 1792 when the monarchy was abolished and the radical Jacobins were ascendant in Paris. Calls for Lafayette's arrest went out, and he was arrested. He would have been arrested as an enemy of the revolution had he not fled the country. He fled the country. He fled across the border to the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, and when he got there, he was arrested as an enemy of the monarchy. So in other words, he fled as an enemy of the revolution and was arrested as an enemy of the monarchy. He spent the next 5 years in prison, in various Austrian prisons. He went back to France in 1799, and he returned to French politics. But he never regained that fame that he had earned in America. And in America was the land in which his reputation always remained pure. And Americans celebrated their Marquis once more during a triumphal tour that took him to every state of the Union in 1824 and 25. And during this year, he went to 24 states, and citizens turned out in unprecedented numbers to celebrate Lafayette. There were all kinds of objects. I guess I would call them tchotchkes today, but I'm sure there was a better word for them at the time. Things like this plate depicting Lafayette at the tomb of Washington. There were things made at every price point celebrating Lafayette. There were balls held in his honor, and women wore gloves with Lafayette's image on them to the balls, and then they saved them and they passed them down to their families. And so every historical society around the United States has all of this wonderful Lafayette material produced in 1824-25. And so when Lafayette died in 1834, the United States observed a national day of mourning, but in Paris he was barely missed. A visiting American, Isaiah Townsend of Albany, wrote to his mother that, quote, "A month has scarcely elapsed since the death of the general, and yet in Paris his memory would seem almost forgotten." And what I'm showing you here is just the fact that, so in 1917, when Chavagnac was collapsing, physically deteriorating, it was a group of Americans who purchased it, and they purchased it with the intention of making it a French Mount Vernon. And I also just wanted to point this out. This is, as you'll see, this is Chavagnac. It's a different image from a different vantage point than I showed you earlier. The one I showed you first depicts Chavagnac as it appeared when Lafayette lived there. This view shows you Chavagnac after this was added, these crenellations with this tower with these crenellations. These were added by the Americans who purchased it because they thought it made it look more medieval. So little does France love Lafayette today that the monumental Critical Dictionary of the French Revolution from 1988 states flatly that, quote, "the man has drawn few eulogies." Now that's patently untrue. They might not like him, but he's drawn many a eulogy. In fact, I believe John Quincy Adams gave a 3-hour eulogy famously when Lafayette died on the floor of the House. And today it's an American flag that marks Lafayette's grave at Picpus Cemetery in Paris. And this grave was restored and maintained by the Benjamin Franklin chapter of the Paris Daughters of the American Revolution. So to end where we began, why should we have a bust of Lafayette? Well, it's not because he was an unsullied hero of American myth. He wasn't. He was human. He engaged in some of the most urgent concerns of his generation, and he adopted only those positions that met his rigorous moral standards, and he clung to them with an uncommon tenacity, even when it meant being driven out of his country as a traitor to one cause and then arrested as a traitor for another. He still remained true to himself, and when he succeeded, he earned eternal gratitude, which is what we see here in this grave in Paris, where the American ambassador goes every 4th of July to honor Lafayette, who is America's hero, even if he was not France's. Thank you. Thank you. So I guess we have a little bit of time for questions. Anybody has any? I sure threw out a lot of information, so I'm sure. Yes, sir.
Pardon me. A few years ago, there was a History Channel show on Washington General. He was featured. And I always thought that, I didn't know, first of all, that our flag would go over his grave until they showed it. I looked up on Wikipedia.
And it's true. If it's on Wikipedia, you know it's true.
What I'm saying is, of the grave,
Yeah.
Wikipedia. So that, but what I'm asking is, you answered one of them, who maintains it? How long has the flag been there? And more importantly, what did they do when the Nazis occupied Paris?
I'm going to turn that over to Chuck.
During the Nazi occupation in Paris, the only American flag that flew during those times was that American flag. The Nazis left it alone because they knew how important it was, and they didn't want to pick a fight. More importantly, in World War I, when we liberated Paris the first time, the French generals at that time, the first place they went was right there. And they said to Lafayette when they arrived there, Lafayette, we are here.
This is Chuck Schwamm, who is the treasurer of the American Friends of Lafayette, and he would be happy to accept new members, I'm sure, after the talk. Thank you, Chuck. Yes, sir.
You know, his brother-in-law moved to the States. They immigrated, a lot of the notable aristocrats. Why did he never consider, you know, taking his wealth and his family and living with his, his friends in the United States?
This is one of the sadder moments, and one of the sadder stories of Lafayette's life, which is that he wanted to. And George Washington didn't want him to. So in 1797, Lafayette was freed from prison in Austria, and he wanted nothing more than to come to the United States. And in fact, he was writing to Adrian, who had joined him in prison but then had gone back to France. He was writing to Adrian from the Netherlands saying, I don't care if I have to take a hot air balloon. He actually wrote that. I have to take a hot air balloon, which was, of course, the new technology of the day. He was actually very excited by hot air balloons. The first one flew in the 1780s. So I'll get there. And he, in fact, had friends who were scouting out farms for him. Some in this neighborhood, some near Mount Vernon, some near Albany. And he was writing, and he wanted to know what he could grow in various places, and he really had every intention of coming. But by the time that he sort of started communicating with Washington about it, the United States was entering into the period known as the Quasi War with France. And things were not very copacetic between the two nations. And Washington wrote back to Lafayette and said, you know, I don't think this is a good time for us to sort of welcome you here. And Lafayette said, no, I'll help. I can broker relations between the two sides. Now, Washington had seen what happened when he tried to broker relations in France. And Lafayette said, that's okay, thank you. Why don't you just sort of stay where you are? I'm sure that you'll get here. Anyway, what ended up happening was he was not given an American passport, even though he kept expecting one. And in 1799, when Napoleon's coup d'etat happened, his wife saw an opening in France and sort of got Lafayette across the French border then when sort of everybody was distracted. And she then went on to broker a deal with Napoleon whereby Lafayette could live in France because Napoleon did not want a rival general floating around, and so she made a deal with him whereby Lafayette could live in France, but he would remain outside of Paris, and he then moved into La Grange, which is her ancestral chateau, and he lived there for most of the rest of his life. It's a sad story. It's a sad story. I mean, it really is. There's actually another story sort of like that. I'm sorry, I'm on a sad note right now. But during the French Revolution, so Adrienne de Lafayette, his wife, took herself and her two daughters and moved after her family was executed and buried here. That's actually why they're all buried here, because this was a mass grave of people who were guillotined at this one particular location in the month of July of 1794. And there were over 1,000 headless bodies buried there in a mass grave. And so the cemetery was then later purchased, after the revolution, was purchased by the families of the victims. And only families of victims can be buried there. Anyway, so after her family was executed, Adrienne de Lafayette took her two daughters and moved to prison with Lafayette. But she sent her son, George Washington Lafayette, to George Washington. And initially, Washington did not want him to come here to Mount Vernon. He did not want to embroil the United States in the French Revolution. And so I actually find this somewhat humorous, because this is actually it's my alma mater, what I'm about to say, is that Washington didn't want George Washington Lafayette to come here, so he sent him to Harvard instead. It was sort of a safety school. But eventually, so he went to Harvard, and then he did eventually come here and live with Washington. But Washington loved Lafayette deeply, but he was also very pragmatic and understood that his role, he could not act simply on his own personal feelings in this case, that there were wider geopolitical implications. Sorry, I rambled. Yes?
Well, it was James Monroe who was instrumental in freeing Lafayette from prison. And I think when his wife left the prison, she was quite ill. She became quite ill. And I don't think she lived too much longer after that.
You're absolutely right. She really sacrificed her life to get him out of prison. She died in 1807, so she did live about 10 years after she was released from prison, but she was never well. And she had all kinds of ailments. She had open wounds that never healed. She had lung problems. And, of course, when you read the... I don't know why I do this, but I do. When you read the descriptions of sort of the quote-unquote cures that she endured, you don't know which is worse, the malady or the remedy. There were leeches involved and, all kinds of other things. And so she, not surprisingly, never regained her strength. So you're absolutely right. She died in 1807. He lived until 1834. So he lived for quite a long time after her death. Any other questions? Perhaps people are eager to get to the reception. Well, thank you all. I believe there are books for sale, which I'll be happy to sign. My bag is there. I put that seat right there. Is that good?
We'll go out this way. We can get you right to your table.
This way. This is very exciting.